Hi everyone, I'm James. If you own an ETF, you probably think that you are diversified. But what if you are not as diversified as you think? Because depending on what it holds, your risk might be more concentrated than you realize. Imagine these two investors. Investor A owns just 6 companies: Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, and Alphabet. Every single investment is in the technology sector. That's a highly concentrated portfolio. Investor B takes a completely different approach. Instead of picking individual companies, they simply buy an ETF that tracks the S&P 500, gaining exposure to nearly 500 companies across 11 different sectors. Most people would probably say Investor B has a much more diversified portfolio. But here's something that surprises many investors. Those same 6 companies, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, and Alphabet, currently makes up roughly 1/3 of the entire S&P 500 by market value. Think about that for a moment. An index with almost 500 companies, yet only 6 companies account for roughly 33% of it. So while the S&P 500 is certainly more diversified than owning just 6 stocks, it still challenges how we usually think about diversification. And that's where many investors get caught out. They assume more companies automatically means more diversification. A common misconception is that diversification simply means owning more companies. In other words, diversification equals to the number of stocks in the portfolio. But that's only part of the picture. True diversification has several dimensions. It's not just about how many companies you own, it's about the type of exposure those companies give you. For example, diversification can come from different companies, but also from different sectors, different countries, different currencies, and even different economic drivers. So you might own hundreds of companies, but if they all sit in the same sector, the same country, or are driven by the same economic forces, your portfolio might still behave like a concentrated bet. In other words, owning more stocks doesn't automatically mean that you are properly diversified across all these dimensions. Let's take a closer look at 3 different market indexes. We'll start with the S&P 500. These are the 10 largest companies in the index and its sectors breakdown. On the surface, it looks well diversified. There are 11 different sectors, from healthcare and financial to consumer goods and energy. But here's the catch. Officially, information technology accounts for about 30% of the index. That's already a significant weighting for a single sector. But the real concentration is even greater. Why? Because many of the largest companies aren't classified as technology companies, even though they are powered by the same technology trends. Take Amazon as an example. It's classified as consumer discretionary, yet one of its biggest profit engine is AWS, its cloud computing business. Or look at Alphabet and Meta. They are classified under communication services, but their businesses are built on AI, digital platforms, and data infrastructure. So while the S&P 500 appears to be spread across 11 sectors, many of its largest companies are still driven by the same underlying economic force, the AI and digital infrastructure ecosystem. In other words, the index is more concentrated than the sector breakdown alone would suggest. While technology companies dominate the S&P 500, Australia's market looks very different. Here are the 10 largest companies in the ASX 200, along with the sector breakdown of the index. The contrast is immediately obvious. Instead of the technology giants like Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia, Australia's largest companies are mostly banks and mining companies. Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, NAB, and ANZ are among the biggest holdings, alongside mining giants like BHP and Rio Tinto. The sector breakdown tells the same story. Financial make up about 1/3 of the index, while material account for another quarter. Together, these two sectors represent almost 60% of the Australian share market. By comparison, technology makes up only about 2%. So why is Australia's market so different? The answer lies in Australia's economy. Australia is one of the world's largest exporters of natural resources, making mining companies some of the country's biggest businesses. At the same time, a handful of highly profitable banks dominate Australia's financial system, growing into some of the largest companies on the share market. The ASX 200 isn't randomly dominated by banks and miners. It reflects the industry that have driven Australia's economy for decades. And that's an important lesson. A market index isn't just a collection of companies. It's a snapshot of a country's economy. Different countries specialize in different industries, so their share markets naturally have different sectors concentrations. Now let's look at South Korea's Kospi 200. Compared with the United States and Australia, the Korean market is even more concentrated. Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix alone make up around 67% of the entire index. Think about it for a moment. Just two companies have a greater influence on the index than the other 198 companies combined. Why is the market so heavily concentrated? The answer, once again, lies in the country's economy. South Korea is the global leader in semiconductors. Samsung Electronics is one of the world's largest technology companies, while SK Hynix is a leading producer of AI memory chips used in data centers and high-performing computing. As demand for AI infrastructure has surged, these two companies have grown so large that they now dominate the Korean share market. Just like the S&P 500 reflects America's leadership in technology, and the ASX 200 reflects Australia's strength in banking and natural resources, the Kospi 200 reflects South Korea's dominance in semiconductors. Once again, the market index is a snapshot of a country's economy. But here's something interesting. Despite these differences, most people don't invest across many different countries. Instead, they tend to invest mainly in their own home market. We recognize local brands, we hear about local companies in the news, we understand the economy we live in. Investing close to home feels more familiar and more comfortable. This behavior is called home bias. And there's nothing wrong with that. The challenge is when investing stays too concentrated in one place. Because different countries tend to have different strengths, industries, and economic cycles. So focusing only on one market can also mean missing exposure to other parts of the global economy. And that's why many investors look beyond their home market when thinking about diversification. But before buying another ETF, ask yourself one simple question. What exposure am I adding? Every ETF gives you a different mix of industries, countries, and companies. So the goal isn't just to own more ETFs. It's to make sure each one adds something to your portfolio it doesn't already have. For example, if you're an Australian investor with most of your money in an ASX 200 ETF, you are already heavily exposed to banks and natural resources. Adding an S&P 500 ETF increases your exposure to technology, healthcare, and other sectors that are less represented in Australia. Now consider another example. If you already own an S&P 500 ETF, you are already heavily exposed to large US technology companies. Adding a Japan or Europe ETF can broaden your exposure to industries like manufacturing, industrials, and consumer goods. The bottom line is, if you own a single country ETF, you may not be as diversified as you think. So take a moment to understand what you actually own inside it. And if there are gaps, consider adding other ETFs to help fill them. I hope you found this useful. Feel free to leave your comments below. Stay focused, everyone, and I'll see you next time.